The silence was wrong. Marcus Thorne had visited his daughter's grave every Sunday for 3 years, and Greenwood Cemetery was always, perfectly, devastatingly quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against your chest until breathing felt like an act of rebellion against grief itself. But today, as his black Bentley rolled through the wrought iron gates, something was different. There was movement where there should be none, life where death had claimed dominion. Through the morning mist, he could see them. 2 figures sitting cross-legged on the grass beside Emma's headstone, a man and a child. Their hands dancing through the air in a language Marcus didn't understand. Their faces animated with a joy that felt like sacrilege in this place of perpetual mourning. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. In 3 years, no one had ever dared to intrude on his private sanctuary. No one had ever presumed to share the sacred space where his 8-year-old daughter rested beneath a granite angel he'd commissioned from Italy. The audacity of it sent a surge of protective fury through his veins. He parked the car with deliberate precision and stepped out, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the frost-covered gravel. The intruders hadn't noticed him yet. They were too absorbed in their silent conversation, hands weaving stories that only they could comprehend. As he drew closer, Marcus could see the man more clearly. 30s, wearing the gray uniform of the cemetery's maintenance staff, his calloused hands moving with surprising grace and fluidity. Beside him, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7 mirrored the movements, his small face lit with concentration and delight. The janitor was teaching the child sign language. Here, on his daughter's grave. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Both figures startled, their hands freezing mid-gesture. The man's head snapped up, revealing tired brown eyes and a face etched with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much alone. The boy Marcus could see now that he was deaf, his eyes darting between his father and the imposing stranger, with the wide, alert expression of someone who reads the world through sight alone. "I'm sorry, sir," the janitor said, scrambling to his feet and dusting grass from his uniform. "We didn't mean to disturb. This is my daughter's grave." The words came out harder than Marcus intended, but the violation felt too raw, too personal. "What are you doing here?" The man's face flushed red, but instead of the stammered apology Marcus expected, something defiant flickered in his eyes. He placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture so instinctive, so fierce, that it reminded Marcus of someone, himself perhaps, in another lifetime when he still believed love could shield the innocent from the world's cruelties. "Teaching my son to say goodbye," the janitor replied quietly. "Emma, I liked watching us practice. I thought maybe she was lonely." The bottom dropped out of Marcus's world. Emma liked watching them. Past tense. As if this stranger had known his daughter, had seen her alive, had witnessed the bright, questioning spirit that leukemia had slowly, mercilessly stolen away. But that was impossible. Emma had died in the sterile isolation of the pediatric oncology ward, surrounded by machines and medicines and the hollow reassurances of specialists who'd given up hope long before Marcus was ready to let go. "What did you just say?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sudden roar of blood in his ears. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The janitor. What was his name? How did he know Emma? Looked down at his son, whose hands were moving in rapid, urgent gestures. Marcus caught fragments. Worry, confusion, the universal language of a child asking, "What's wrong?" The man's response was swift and reassuring, his fingers forming shapes that somehow conveyed calm, even as his own eyes betrayed mounting anxiety. "My name is David Chen," the man said, meeting Marcus's gaze directly. "We've been coming here for 8 months?" "Ever since." He paused, swallowing hard. "Ever since Alex's mother died. The cancer ward recommended this place, said it was peaceful." Cancer ward. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. This man, this janitor, had walked the same endless hallways Marcus had haunted, had sat in the same plastic chairs, breathed the same recycled air thick with antiseptic and unspoken fears, had watched someone he loved disappear by degrees, day by agonizing day. Alex was born deaf, David continued, his voice growing stronger. His mother was learning sign language when she got sick. After she died, I had to learn fast, really fast. And Emma. His voice cracked slightly. Emma used to watch us practice from her room window. She'd wave at Alex, make faces to make him laugh. The nurses said it was the only time she smiled during those last few weeks. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. His Emma, his shy, bookish Emma, who'd been too sick to make friends, too weak to play, had found connection with this silent little boy. While Marcus had been consumed with medical consultations and experimental treatments and the desperate arithmetic of hope, his daughter had been reaching across the void, offering comfort to another child touched by loss. "Room 314, Marcus said, the words falling from his lips like stones. She was in room 314. David nodded slowly. "3rd floor, east wing. Her window faced the courtyard where we practiced every afternoon during visiting hours." Alex would get so excited when he saw her watching. He'd show off, teach her signs through the glass. A small smile ghosted across his features. She was a amen, natural, quick learner. Alex used to say she had good hands. The memory crashed over Marcus with stunning clarity. Emma's inexplicable fascination with her hands during those final weeks, the way she'd move her fingers in strange, deliberate patterns when she thought no one was looking. He'd asked the doctors about it, another side effect, perhaps, another cruel symptom to add to the endless list. They'd dismissed it as harmless fidgeting, a coping mechanism. None of them had recognized it for what it truly was. His daughter, learning a new language in the shadow of death, building a bridge to a boy who understood what it meant to live in silence. "She never told me," Marcus breathed. Of course she hadn't. In those final months, their conversations had been carefully choreographed. Dances around the truth neither of them was brave enough to speak aloud. They'd talked about books and movies, and tomorrow's breakfast, anything except the obvious fact that there might not be many tomorrows left. "Kids know when adults are scared," David said gently. "Sometimes they protect us by keeping their joys secret." Alex tugged at his father's sleeve, his small hands forming urgent questions. David translated in quick, fluid gestures, and Marcus caught the moment when understanding dawned in the boy's eyes. The child looked at Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been recognition. Then, slowly, deliberately, Alex lifted his hands and began to sign. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he knew somehow, with absolute certainty, that he was watching his daughter's name take shape in the air. Alex was introducing himself to Emma's father, using the language she'd learned to reach across the impossible distance between her world and his. The tears came without warning, hot and unstoppable. Marcus, who hadn't cried since the funeral, who'd armored himself in work and routine and the brittle efficiency of grief management, found himself sobbing in front of two strangers who somehow weren't strangers at all. They were the last people to share a conversation with his daughter, the final witnesses to her joy. David started to move toward him, one hand extended in an instinctive gesture of comfort, then caught himself. The space between them was vast. Not just physical distance, but the chasm that separated Marcus Thorne billionaire real estate developer, from David Chen, cemetery maintenance worker. Money and class and education had built walls between them that simple human kindness couldn't easily breach. But Alex had no such inhibitions. The 6-year-old walked directly to Marcus and, with the fearless compassion of childhood, wrapped his small arms around the grieving man's waist. The hug was fierce and warm and entirely without judgment. In that moment, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but blooming. A space where light could enter. "Thank you," Marcus whispered into Alex's dark hair, his voice raw. "Thank you for being her friend." Alex pulled back and looked up at Marcus with solemn eyes. Then, very carefully, he lifted his hands and signed something that needed no translation. The universal gesture for love, hands crossed over heart. Then extended outward. A message from one grieving soul to another. "You are not alone. Lansu, Lansu." David watched the exchange with wonder and wariness warring in his expression. This was dangerous territory. The collision of two worlds that weren't supposed to intersect. Rich men didn't kneel in cemeteries accepting comfort from janitors' children, but the laws of money and power held no sway in this place where grief was the great equalizer. "I should let you have your time," David said finally, his voice carefully neutral. He reached for Alex's hand. "Come on, buddy. We should head home." "Wait." Marcus rose to his feet, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. For 3 years, he'd stood alone beside Emma's grave, trapped in the echo chamber of his own sorrow. But now he'd been offered something he hadn't known he needed. Proof that his daughter's final weeks had held moments of connection, friendship, joy. "Please, don't go. I want to know more." About Emma and Alex. About what they shared. David hesitated, caught between the magnetic pull of Marcus's grief and the practical reality of their circumstances. He was a working-class single father, with a dozen cemetery sections to maintain before his shift ended. Marcus Thorne was a man whose time was worth thousands of dollars per minute, whose face graced business magazines, whose signature appeared on buildings across 3 states. They inhabited different universes, but Alex was already settling back onto the grass beside Emma's headstone, his hands moving, in animated conversation with someone only he could see. He was telling her about the stranger with kind eyes and sad face. Marcus realized he was including Emma in this moment of connection, refusing to let death interrupt their friendship. "All right," David said softly. "We can stay a little longer." As Marcus sank down beside them on the frost-dampened earth, his expensive suit forgotten, something fundamental shifted in the morning light. The silence he'd grown to hate was filling with new sounds. Not spoken words, but the whisper of hands through air. The language of healing beginning to bridge the gap between two broken hearts. Neither man could have imagined that this accidental meeting would reshape both their lives completely. Marcus, who'd spent 3 years learning how to live with loss, was about to discover the difference between surviving grief and transcending it. David, who'd been carrying the weight of single parenthood and poverty alone, was about to meet someone who understood that love could be both the source of deepest pain and the path to redemption. But first, they would sit together beside a small granite angel and let a 6-year-old boy teach them both how to say goodbye in a language that had no words, only the infinite eloquence of hands reaching toward understanding. The morning mist was beginning to lift, but something deeper was just beginning to take shape in the space between them. Something that looked like hope, wearing the quiet face of friendship. Something that sounded like Emma's laughter carried on the wind. End of Part 1. Word count: 2,047 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? The investigation and connection? This section will delve deeper into both men's backstories, show Marcus learning about David's struggles, and build the foundation of their growing relationship. As Marcus begins to understand what Emma's final gift truly means. The first thing Marcus learned about David Chen was that he worked 3 jobs. It took him exactly 48 hours to discover this. Not through any corporate espionage or background checks, but through the simple act of paying attention. On Tuesday evening, Marcus returned to Greenwood Cemetery at closing time and watched David finish his maintenance rounds. Instead of heading to a car, David walked 6 blocks to a bus stop, still in his gray uniform, carrying a worn backpack. Marcus followed at a distance in his Bentley, feeling ridiculous and intrusive, but unable to stop himself. The bus took David to Mercy General Hospital, where he disappeared through a service entrance. Marcus sat in the visitor parking lot for 2 hours until David emerged, now wearing the navy blue scrubs of a night custodian. The man worked until dawn, then caught another bus home to the modest apartment complex where Marcus had watched him disappear the previous morning. Wednesday night, Marcus followed the same ritual, this time discovering that David spent Thursday evenings at Roosevelt Elementary, cleaning classrooms and hallways, while Alex did homework in the main office under the watchful eye of the school secretary. By Friday, Marcus had pieced together David's weekly schedule. Cemetery maintenance during the day, hospital custodian 3 nights a week, school cleaning 2 evenings, with weekends devoted entirely to Alex. It was an exhausting, relentless cycle that left no room for rest, let alone the luxury of grief. David Chen was a man perpetually in motion, fueled by necessity and love in equal measure. Marcus found himself both humbled and haunted by the arithmetic of survival. He was witnessing the brutal calculations of a single father who worked 80 hours a week just to keep his small family afloat. The investigation, if it could be called that, began as a form of procrastination. Marcus told himself he was simply curious about the man who'd known Emma's final joy. But as the days passed, curiosity transformed into something deeper and more troubling. A growing awareness of his own profound ignorance about how most people actually lived. Marcus Thorne inhabited a world where problems were solved with phone calls and wire transfers, where inconvenience was a delayed flight or a server outage. He'd spent 3 years drowning in the luxury of uninterrupted grief, able to take extended leave from Thorne development, while teams of assistants and executives kept his empire running. David Chen had buried his wife and returned to work the next week because missing paychecks meant eviction notices and empty refrigerators. The contrast was stark and shameful. Marcus began to understand that his sorrow, however genuine, had been a privilege he'd never recognized. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus made an excuse to visit Greenwood Cemetery during David's shift. He found him in the older section, carefully tending to a cluster of weathered headstones that clearly belonged to people whose families had long since moved away or passed on themselves. David worked with meticulous attention, clearing weeds and polishing granite with the same care he'd shown Emma's elaborate monument. "You don't have to do that," Marcus observed, approaching slowly. "Those graves. There's no one left to notice." David looked up, unsurprised by Marcus's presence. Over the past week, they developed an unspoken understanding. Marcus would appear at seemingly random times, always with some transparent excuse, checking on Emma's headstone, discussing landscaping with the groundskeeper, reviewing security measures. David never challenged these obvious fabrications, but his eyes held a knowing wariness. "Someone should notice," David replied simply, returning to his work. "Everyone deserves to be remembered, whether they have fancy monuments or not." The words carried no judgment, but Marcus felt them like an accusation nonetheless. How many people had he failed to notice over the years? How many David Chens had crossed his path, invisible in their gray uniforms and quiet dignity? "Where's Alex today?" "One?" Marcus asked, settling onto a nearby bench uninvited. School, then aftercare program until 6. Mrs. Patterson watches him for free because she knows I can't afford proper child care. The admission cost him something. Marcus could see. Pride was perhaps the only luxury David allowed himself, and even that was carefully rationed. The sign language, Marcus said carefully. How did you learn so quickly after your wife died? David's hands stilled on the cloth he was using to clean the headstone. YouTube videos, library books, trial and error. He glanced at Marcus. May was the one with the gift for languages. She was going to teach Alex Mandarin too, once he mastered ASL. She had all these plans. His voice trailed off into the familiar territory where grief lives, the landscape of interrupted futures and abandoned dreams. Marcus recognized it intimately. What was she like? Marcus asked quietly. May! A smile ghosted across David's features, the first genuine warmth Marcus had seen from him. Stubborn. Brilliant. She was an accountant, but she wanted to go back to school, become a teacher for deaf children. She said Alex taught her that communication wasn't about sound, it was about connection. She sounds remarkable. She was. David resumed his cleaning with renewed vigor, channeling emotion into motion. Cancer took her in 6 months. Started in her lungs. Spread everywhere. The bills. He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he was sharing too much with someone who couldn't possibly understand. But Marcus did understand, in a way David couldn't know. The helplessness of watching someone you love disappear into hospital machinery, the desperate bargaining with invisible forces, the final, crushing realization that all the money in the world couldn't purchase a single extra day with the person who mattered most. Medical debt, Marcus said, not making it a question. David's silence was answer enough. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He remembered his own experience with Emma's illness. The parade of specialists flown in from around the world. The experimental treatments available only to patients who could pay cash, the private rooms and dedicated nurses, and every possible comfort money could provide. None of it had saved Emma, but at least Marcus had been able to fight her disease with every weapon wealth could provide. David had watched his wife die, in the knowledge that better care existed somewhere beyond his reach. The cemetery job, Marcus realized aloud. It comes with health insurance. Basic coverage, enough to keep Alex healthy. David's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the underlying message. Don't pity me. This is just reality. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the graves. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma's final weeks, viewing them through this new lens. While he'd been agonizing over second opinions and experimental protocols, his daughter had been learning to communicate with a boy whose family couldn't afford such luxuries. She'd found joy, not in the expensive distractions Marcus provided, but in the simple act of connection across difference. Alex seems like a remarkable child, Marcus said eventually. He is. David's voice warmed immediately. Smart as hell. Funnier than any 6-year-old should be. He wants to be an artist when he grows up. Draws constantly. A shadow crossed his features. I just hope I can give him the opportunities he deserves. What kind of opportunities? David hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was easier than pretense. Art classes, better schools, college someday, the things May and I planned before. He shrugged helplessly. Right now, I'm just trying to keep him fed and housed and happy. Long-term planning is a luxury I can't afford. Marcus thought about his own childhood, about the private tutors and elite schools, and traveling opportunities he'd taken for granted, about Emma's short life, filled with every advantage money could provide, except the one that mattered most. Time. What if he could have those opportunities? Marcus asked quietly. David's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing with sudden wariness. What do you mean? What if someone wanted to help? To invest in Alex's future? No. The word was sharp, immediate. David rose from his knees, putting physical distance between them. No charity. No handouts. I won't be anyone's project. That's not what Isn't it? David's voice carried a bitter edge Marcus hadn't heard before. Rich man feels guilty about his advantages, decides to save the poor janitor and his kid. Thanks. But we're fine. The rejection stung, partly because it was so absolute, and partly because it wasn't entirely unfair. Marcus had been thinking about Alex as a problem to solve, a way to assuage his own guilt through grand gestures. He'd been thinking like a billionaire, not like a friend. You're right, Marcus said quietly. I'm sorry. That was presumptuous. David studied him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Alex and we're not broken things that need fixing. We're just getting by. Like most people. I know. I'm learning that. Marcus stood, brushing dirt from his pants. Can I ask you something else? David nodded warily. Why do you let me keep coming here? Why do you talk to me at all? The question seemed to catch David off guard. He looked down at the headstone he'd been cleaning, considering his answer. Because you loved Emma, he said finally. And because Alex loved Emma. And because grief shouldn't be something you carry alone. He met Marcus's eyes. Rich or poor, losing someone is the worst thing that can happen to a person. Money doesn't make that hurt any less. The simple wisdom of it, the generous recognition of shared humanity, despite their vast differences, left Marcus momentarily speechless. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For seeing past the money to the pain? For treating me like a person instead of a bank account? David's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Maybe we're both learning something. As Marcus walked back to his car, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The possibility of friendship, not the strategic alliances that populated his business world, not the careful social connections maintained by his assistant, but genuine human friendship built on shared understanding rather than mutual benefit. That evening, instead of returning to his empty penthouse, Marcus drove to the public library in David's neighborhood. He spent 2 hours researching sign language resources, deaf education programs, and support services for single parents. Not because he was planning another attempt at charity, but because he wanted to understand David's world better. He wanted to be useful, not just rich. The librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, helped him find beginner ASL videos and recommended several books about deaf culture. As Marcus checked out his stack of materials, Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Learning sign language? That's wonderful. It's such a beautiful way to communicate. I'm hoping to talk with a friend's son, Marcus explained. He taught my daughter some signs before she died. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes filled with genuine sympathy. But what a lovely way to honor her memory, learning to speak his language. Marcus nodded, surprised by the warmth of this stranger's kindness. In his usual world, condolences were formal and careful, delivered by people who barely knew him. Mrs. Rodriguez's spontaneous compassion reminded him that human kindness existed everywhere if he bothered to notice it. Over the next week, Marcus threw himself into learning ASL with the same intensity he'd once brought to hostile takeovers. He practiced finger spelling until his hands cramped, memorized basic vocabulary, and watched instructional videos during his commute. His assistant, Patricia, initially worried he was having some kind of breakdown. Marcus Thorne did not typically spend his lunch breaks learning manual alphabets in empty conference rooms. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon when Marcus returned to Greenwood Cemetery and found David teaching Alex new signs beside Emma's grave. Marcus approached slowly, practicing the greeting he'd memorized that morning. "Hello," Marcus signed carefully, his fingers forming the simple gesture. "Nice to see you." Alex's face lit up with delight and surprise. He responded with a rapid flurry of signs that Marcus couldn't follow. But the joy in the boy's movements was unmistakable. "He says, 'You have good hands?'" David translated, his own expression betraying surprise and something that might have been respect. "He's impressed that you're learning." "I wanted to be able to talk with him," Marcus explained, then attempted to sign his words as he spoke them. His movements were clumsy and slow, but Alex watched with patient attention. "Emma would like this," Alex signed, and David translated automatically. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not painful, but profound. Yes, Emma would like this. His bookish, curious daughter would love that her friendship with Alex had inspired her father to learn something entirely new. She'd always complained that Marcus was too busy to learn anything that wasn't directly related to business. "Will you teach me more?" Marcus asked Alex directly, his signs careful and deliberate. Alex nodded eagerly, then launched into an enthusiastic explanation of the signs he'd taught Emma through her hospital window. David translated, his voice growing softer as he described his son's memories. Emma's delight when she successfully fingerspelled her name, her proud demonstration of the sign for friend, her promise to keep practicing even when she was tired. "She said she wanted to surprise you," Alex signed, and Marcus felt tears gathering in his eyes. "She said you worked too hard and forgot to play." Out of the mouths of babes, even facing death, Emma had been worried about her father's inability to find joy. Her friendship with Alex had been many things, but perhaps most importantly, it had been an act of pure play communication for the sake of connection. Learning for the love of learning. She was right, Marcus admitted aloud. I did forget how to play. For the next hour, Alex became Marcus's patient teacher, correcting his hand positions and applauding his successful attempts at new vocabulary. David watched the lesson with growing amazement, seeing this powerful businessman transform into someone humble and eager to learn. The three of them sat together on the grass beside Emma's headstone, building a bridge of understanding, one sign at a time. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower, Alex tugged on his father's sleeve and signed something urgent. "He wants to know if you'll come back tomorrow," David translated. "He says Emma likes it when we're all here together." Marcus looked at the small boy with the serious eyes and generous heart, then at David, with his quiet strength and fierce love for his son. He thought about his empty penthouse, his scheduled dinners with business associates, his carefully managed life that left no room for spontaneity or genuine connection. "Yes," Marcus signed directly to Alex, his movements growing more confident. "I'll come back." The smile that spread across Alex's face was like sunlight breaking through clouds. He threw his arms around Marcus in a spontaneous hug, the same fearless affection he'd shown on that first morning. But this time, Marcus was ready for it. He hugged back, marveling at how something so simple could feel so transformative. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. As they prepared to leave, David hesitated, then made a decision that would change everything. "Alex has a school art show next Thursday evening," he said quietly, his first time having his work displayed. "I know you're probably busy. But," he trailed off. Suddenly uncertain. "I'd be honored to attend," Marcus said immediately. "What time?" 7 o'clock? Roosevelt Elementary. David's voice carried a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "It's not fancy. Just kids' drawings and crafts in the school cafeteria." "It sounds perfect," Marcus replied, and meant it completely. As he drove home that evening, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that first shocking encounter at Emma's graveside. He was beginning to understand that David hadn't just been teaching Alex sign language during those afternoon sessions, he'd been demonstrating something much more profound. The power of patient, persistent love. The courage to remain open despite overwhelming loss. The grace of finding joy in small moments, even when the world felt fundamentally broken. David Chen was teaching Marcus how to live again, one sign at a time. And like Emma before him, Marcus was proving to be an eager student, ready to learn the language of connection that he'd somehow never mastered despite all his worldly success. The lesson was just beginning, but already Marcus could feel the silence in his life taking on new meaning. It was no longer the empty absence of sound, but the rich, expectant quiet that comes before meaningful conversation begins. Tomorrow, he would return to Emma's grave with hands that could speak, and a heart that was finally ready to listen. The collision that had started in grief was transforming into something unprecedented. The possibility of healing built on the foundation of friendship, understanding, and love that transcended every boundary money could create. Roosevelt Elementary was nothing like the private institutions Marcus had attended or the exclusive schools he'd toured for Emma before her diagnosis. The hallways were narrow and worn, lined with bright but fading motivational posters and children's artwork taped to painted cinder block walls. The scent of industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food and the particular mustiness that seemed to permeate all aging public buildings. Marcus arrived at 6:30, 30 minutes before the art show was scheduled to begin, wearing the most casual clothes he owned, khakis, and a button-down shirt that probably still cost more than David made in a week. He felt conspicuously out of place as he navigated the hallway, following hand-drawn signs toward the cafeteria where children's laughter echoed off linoleum floors. The transformation was remarkable. What was clearly a utilitarian lunchroom during the day had been converted into a gallery of sorts, with long tables displaying an array of student artwork. Construction paper collages hung from clotheslines strung between ceiling tiles, and easels displayed paintings in every color imaginable. Parents and siblings milled about, smartphones capturing memories, voices raised in celebration and encouragement. Marcus spotted Alex immediately. The 6-year-old stood beside a small easel, wearing his best button-up shirt and a tie that was slightly crooked. His face glowed with nervous excitement as he watched visitors examine his artwork, a vibrant watercolor of 2 figures sitting beneath a large tree, one tall, one small, their hands raised in what Marcus now recognized as sign language. David stood nearby, his own pride evident, but tempered by the careful vigilance of a parent, ensuring his child felt supported without being overwhelmed. He wore dress pants and a shirt Marcus suspected had been purchased specifically for this evening, pressed with the kind of care that spoke of limited options and maximum effort. "Marcus!" Alex spotted him across the room and waved enthusiastically, then launched into rapid sign language. "He says he's excited to show you his painting." David translated as Marcus approached, his voice warm but holding an undertone of surprise. "He wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied, signing his response as well as speaking it. His ASL was still elementary, but Alex beamed at the effort. Marcus studied the watercolor more closely, recognizing the scene it depicted. The large tree was clearly the oak that shaded Emma's grave, and the two figures were unmistakably Alex and David, engaged in one of their sign language lessons. But there was something else, a third figure painted in lighter strokes, almost translucent, sitting beside the tree with long, dark hair and a gentle smile. Emma, Alex signed simply when he saw Marcus notice the ghostly third figure. The breath caught in Marcus's throat. A 6-year-old boy had painted his dead daughter into his artwork, not as a morbid reminder of loss, but as a continuing presence, a friend who remained part of his story. The inclusion was so natural, so matter-of-fact, that Marcus felt his entire understanding of grief shift slightly. "It's beautiful, Alex," Marcus managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely beautiful." The evening unfolded with the chaotic warmth characteristic of elementary school events. Marcus found himself drawn into conversations with other parents, sharing stories about the young artists, and marveling at the creativity on display. For the first time in years, he was simply a man attending a child's school function. Not Marcus Thorne, the billionaire developer. Not the grieving father who'd lost everything that mattered. Mrs. Patterson, the school secretary David had mentioned, approached during a quiet moment. She was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes, and the efficient bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing both children and bureaucracy. "You must be the friend David mentioned," she said, extending a hand. "I'm so glad Alex has more people celebrating his talent." "He's an exceptional child," Marcus replied honestly. "He is, and he's had a harder road than most." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the careful neutrality of an educator who'd seen too many struggling families to judge, but who couldn't hide her concern entirely. "David's a good father. One of the best I've seen. But," she paused, glancing toward where David was helping Alex explain his painting to a cluster of impressed second graders. "But what?" "This school doesn't have an art program," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Budget cuts eliminated it 3 years ago. Alex's teacher lets him use supplies from her own pocket during recess, but there's no formal instruction, no advanced materials. That painting? He did it with watercolors meant for kindergarteners." Marcus looked back at Alex's sophisticated composition with new eyes. The boy had created something beautiful and meaningful, despite having access to the most basic supplies. What could he accomplish with proper materials, instruction, guidance? "David mentioned Alex wants to be an artist," Marcus said carefully. "Wants to be, and could be," Mrs. Patterson corrected. "But wanting doesn't pay for art classes or supplies, or the kind of portfolio he'd need for specialized programs later on. David works himself to the bone, just keeping them housed and fed." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. A woman's voice, raised in frustration, cut through the celebratory atmosphere. "This is completely unacceptable. How am I supposed to explain this to my husband?" Marcus turned to see a well-dressed woman in her 40s, gesticulating angrily at a younger teacher who looked increasingly distressed. Other parents had begun to notice the disruption, conversations quieting as attention shifted toward the developing conflict. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Albertson, but the decision has already been made," the teacher was saying. "We simply don't have the funding." "This school receives tax dollars from our neighborhood too," the woman interrupted. "Premium tax dollars. My property alone generates more revenue than half this district combined. If my Brittany can't get the educational opportunities she deserves here, we'll have to consider private alternatives." Marcus felt his jaw clench with recognition. He'd heard this tone countless times in business. The casual wielding of financial influence as a weapon, the assumption that money entitled one to outcomes regardless of broader consequences. It was a voice he'd used himself, more often than he cared to admit. "What's happening?" David had appeared beside him, Alex in tow, both looking concerned by the disruption. Budget meeting aftermath. Mrs. Patterson explained quietly. The district cut funding for the reading specialist position. Some parents aren't happy. The reading specialist? David's face went pale. Mrs. Chen helps Alex with… He stopped abruptly, his expression shuddering. Alex needs extra reading support? Marcus asked gently. David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He's brilliant, but deaf children often struggle with reading comprehension. Written English is essentially a second language when your first language is visual. Mrs. Chen has been working with Alex twice a week, helping him bridge that gap. And now? Now he'll have to manage without, David said, his voice carefully controlled. But Marcus could see the worry beneath the surface, the calculation of a parent trying to figure out how to fill yet another gap in his child's education. Mrs. Albertson's voice rose again. If this school can't provide adequate services, perhaps it's time for the district to consider which families truly contribute to the tax base and deserve priority consideration. The ugly implication hung in the air. Resources should flow to those who paid the most, regardless of who needed them most. It was a philosophy Marcus knew intimately, the brutal mathematics of capitalism applied to public education. He watched Alex's face as the argument continued, seeing the boy's confusion and growing distress. Alex couldn't hear the specific words, but he could read the tension in the room, the way other children had begun to cluster closer to their parents. His small hand found David's, and he signed a question. He wants to know if we have to leave. David translated softly. The simple question crystallized everything for Marcus. Here was a child who'd already lost his mother, who lived with the daily challenges of deafness in a hearing world, who possessed genuine artistic talent and was thriving despite overwhelming obstacles. And he was asking if he'd have to leave the one stable educational environment he'd known because people like Mrs. Albertson, people like Marcus himself, viewed public resources as commodities to be claimed by the highest bidder. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He walked directly to Mrs. Turn Albertson, his bearing commanding enough that conversations quieted around them. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had closed billion-dollar deals and silenced corporate boardrooms. Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your concerns about school funding. Mrs. Albertson turned, her expression shifting as she registered his expensive clothes and confident demeanor. Yes, well, it's really quite appalling. These children deserve better than what they're receiving. I agree completely, Marcus said, which is why I'd like to make a proposal to the district. A private donation to restore the reading specialist position and establish a permanent arts education program. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening. How much of a donation? The young teacher asked breathlessly. Marcus considered the question. How much was Alex's education worth? How much would it cost to ensure that every child in this school had access to the support they needed? How much was too much, and how much was nowhere near enough? $5 million, he said quietly. To establish an endowment that will fund both positions permanently, plus additional support staff as needed. The number hit the room like a physical force. Mrs. Albertson's mouth fell open. Parents began murmuring to each other in amazement. Mrs. Patterson looked like she might faint, but Marcus only had eyes for David and Alex. David's face had gone through a complex progression of emotions: shock, gratitude, suspicion, and finally something that looked like resignation. "Could I speak with you outside?" David asked quietly. Marcus nodded, following David and Alex into the hallway. The buzz of amazed conversation faded behind them as the cafeteria door swung shut. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David's voice was low, but furious. "I'm helping," Marcus said, confused by the reaction. "Alex needs that reading specialist, and this school clearly needs that 7 sides. Resources—" "This isn't helping," David interrupted. "This is showing off. This is you solving a problem by throwing money at it so everyone can see how generous you are?" "That's not—" Marcus began, then stopped. Wasn't it? Hadn't he just performed his wealth in the most public way possible, turning a child's art show into a stage for his own redemption narrative? "You want to know what you just did?" David continued, his hands shaking slightly with anger. "You made Alex the charity case. You made every person in that room look at my son and think, 'There's the kid the rich man felt sorry for.' You turned him into a symbol of your guilt, instead of seeing him as a human being." The words hit Marcus like physical blows because they contained too much truth to dismiss. He had acted impulsively, reacting to his own discomfort with Mrs. Albertson's attitudes rather than considering how his grand gesture would affect the people he claimed to be helping. Alex was watching the exchange with growing distress, his hands moving in rapid questions that David answered with tense, reassuring signs. "I was trying to help," Marcus said weakly. "Were you? Or were you trying to prove something to yourself? Trying to fix your guilt over Emma by turning my son into your redemption project?" The accusation cut deep because it held uncomfortable echoes of truth. Marcus thought about his investigation into David's life, his impulse to solve problems with money, his need to be useful rather than simply present. Had he learned anything at all from their growing friendship? Or had he simply found a more sophisticated way to maintain emotional distance while feeling virtuous about his generosity? "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "You're right. I wasn't thinking about Alex. I was thinking about myself." David's anger seemed to deflate slightly. "Look, I appreciate what you were trying to do. The school does need resources, and Alex does need that reading specialist. But there's a right way to help and a wrong way. Making it about us, making it personal, that's the wrong way." David considered the question, glancing back toward the cafeteria where the buzz of conversation continued. "Anonymous," he said finally. "Private," letting the school administration take credit. "Helping, without making yourself the hero of the story. Can I fix this? I don't know. Maybe." David's expression softened slightly as he saw the genuine remorse in Marcus's eyes. "But you need to understand something. Alex and we're not your chance to feel better about having money while other people struggle. We're not your opportunity to prove you're a good person despite being rich. We're just people. People who might be your friends if you can figure out how to see us that way." The conversation was interrupted by Alex tugging on David's sleeve. His small face creased with worry. He signed something urgent, and David's expression immediately shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. "He says people in there are pointing at him, saying his name. He wants to know if he did something wrong." Marcus felt his heart sink. His grand gesture, intended to help, had turned a 6-year-old boy into the center of unwanted attention at what should have been a celebration of his artistic achievement. "I need to fix this," Marcus said, more to himself than to David. "How?" Marcus thought quickly, his business mind shifting into crisis management mode. "I'm going to go back in there and redirect the conversation. Make it about the school's needs generally, not about Alex specifically. Downplay the personal connection." "That might help," David agreed cautiously. But as they prepared to return to the cafeteria, Alex signed something that made David stop in his tracks. "What did he say?" David's voice was tight when he answered. "He asked if this means Emma would be proud of us." The simple question cut through all of Marcus's complicated emotions and strategic thinking. A 6-year-old boy was asking if their dead friend would approve of the adult's clumsy attempts to navigate the intersection of love, money, and good intentions. Marcus knelt down so he was at Alex's eye level and signed carefully, choosing his words with more thought than he'd given to most corporate negotiations. "Emma would be proud of your painting," he said, speaking as he signed. "Emma would be proud that you're kind to people. Emma would want us to be friends who help each other the right way." Alex considered this, then signed a response that David translated with a slight smile. "He says Emma would want us to go back inside and eat cake before it's all gone." Despite everything, Marcus laughed. He's absolutely right. They returned to the cafeteria together, where Marcus spent the next hour quietly working to repair the damage he'd caused. He deflected questions about his donation, redirected credit to the teachers and administrators, and gradually helped the conversation return to celebrating the children's artwork. By the end of the evening, the focus had shifted back where it belonged, on young artists sharing their creativity with proud families. As the crowd began to thin and parents collected children and artwork, Mrs. Patterson approached Marcus with a knowing look. "Nicely handled," she said quietly. "Both the problem and the solution." "I made a mistake," Marcus admitted. "Rich people usually do when they first try to help," she said pragmatically. "The important thing is whether you learn from it." As Marcus prepared to leave, Alex ran up to him carrying his watercolor painting. "For you," Alex signed, holding out the artwork that depicted the three of them, him, David, and Emma, beneath the cemetery oak. "Alex, no," David protested. "You should keep that." But Alex was insistent, pressing the painting into Marcus's hands with the generous spirit that seemed to characterize everything he did. "He says you need it more than he does," David translated, his voice soft with emotion. "He says Emma would want you to have it." Marcus looked down at the painting, at the translucent figure of his daughter included so naturally in Alex's world, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This child, who had so little, was giving him the most precious thing he possessed, not just the artwork, but the generous assumption that Marcus belonged in their story, that he was worthy of being depicted alongside the people Alex loved most. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with tears he didn't try to hide. As he drove home that night, the painting carefully secured in his passenger seat, Marcus reflected on how much he still had to learn about friendship, about helping, about being present, without overwhelming. But for the first time since Emma's death, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, not just surviving his grief, but transforming it into something that might serve others. David was right. Alex wasn't his redemption project. But maybe, if Marcus could learn to see them as they truly were, as fully realized human beings deserving of friendship rather than charity, they could all find a way to heal together. The painting would hang in Marcus's office, a daily reminder that love comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you can give, but what you're willing to receive. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.